Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads for 8 books. Wild Thorns by Sahar, Khalifeh, translated by Trevor Legasic and Elizabeth Vernier. Ian McEwan's new book, What We Can Know. The 5 Sorrowful Mysteries of Andy Africa by Stephen Buoro. Pharricide by Frenchman Vincent de Swarte, translated by Nicholas Royal. Yambo, Ouologuem, Bound to Violence, translated by Ralph Mannheim. Stella Gaitano, Edo Souls, translated by Sawad Hussein. False War by Carlos Manuel Alvarez, translated by Natasha Wimmer. And finally some poetry. Mirceau Cartarescu, A Spider's History of Love, translated by Adam J. Sorokin. Okay, so I am going to start with Wild Thorns by Sahar Khalifeh. So I read the Book of Disappearances, which I think was Booker International longlisted. And I was so disappointed in it as a sort of contemporary piece of literature on Palestine that I went and sought out a Palestinian classic, which this definitely is. This is from 1974. However, it's interesting that it's actually, although I would still say it holds up in terms of its literary qualities, it's a bit of a time capsule from that period. So in 1972 you had the Yom Kippur War, which once the Israelis repelled the invasion on their holiest of holy days, Yom Kippur, pretty much represented the last time that the external Arab neighbouring states tried to intercede on behalf of the Palestinians by invading Israel. And since that time, you know, we've had with the Palestinians left very much on their own to fight their cause. We've had 2 intifadas, we've had the security/apartheid security wall in the face of suicide bombings, and then of course we've had the recent Gaza campaign. And it's a totally different landscape from the one represented here. So, which is obviously not the author's fault because this is written in 74. So it starts off with a Palestinian Arab who's returning home after living and working abroad in Kuwait and in Jordan, and it starts with a humiliating border crossing interrogation where he's asked by sort of several different Israeli security people, you know, what are you doing here? You know, why have you been absent for so long? Who are your relatives? And you know, he's giving the same answer over and over again, that he's coming back for his mother and also to get married, find a wife and get married. And eventually he's passed through, but actually he is on a mission. He's been armed with a mission from Palestinian planners who reside outside of Israel-Palestine. So he's one of the characters, but he's coming back into the bosom of his family, having been absent from Palestine. I can't remember for how many years. And he notices the differences and the things that have stayed the same, the cultural, everyday things that have changed the same. But the conditions that he encounters, particularly through one of his cousins, who is responsible for the family of 9. He has an ailing father who's on a kidney machine. And he has the family farm, and what the secret that this guy Adil holds is that he has made a compromise that many Palestinians were beginning to make, and that is that he is working inside Israel outside of Nablus and the Palestinian territories. He's working in Israeli factories because the standard of living it provides is higher than the Palestinians can earn working within their own communities. And this is looked down by many Palestinians. It's called, gone inside, i.e. gone inside Israel. It's almost like collaboration as far as they're concerned. So it's a secret that none of his family know, but it's how he keeps them afloat because of the money. But unfortunately the family farm is going to absolute pot because he's obviously neglecting it. So he's another character in this book. And it paints up the divisions within the Palestinian society very well, I think. Particularly as I say, the sort of economic, those who will work for the Israelis, those who won't, but a sort of more general class system. But another way that I think it's aged rather badly, or other than providing a sort of a historical snapshot, a great chunk of this novel takes place in an Israeli prison where Palestinian prisoners are. And this is 1974, so they are able to receive letters, they are able to receive visitors, they are able to have books sent into them, they conduct sort of Palestinian Marxist theory and consciousness-raising sessions. So, for a sort of military prison, not totally illiberal, whereas I'm sure since the suicide bombings and thereafter, that the Israeli prisons now for the Palestinians are not nearly so tolerant in what they will allow. So again, a big chunk of this book happens within the prison, and it's a really well-drawn portrait. But I don't think it holds anymore. I think conditions have got a lot worse. Privations are a lot worse. Security is a lot more heavy. And equally, here, the workers who are going into Israel to work in the factories, all they have to do is hop on buses, the local buses, and they're transported to the factories. Now, of course, with the security wall in place, or the apartheid wall, depending where you stand, the humiliation of Palestinians having to cross through that security gate every day just to go to work is enormous. And then on top of that, now you've got the whole sort of recent Gaza war. So I still recommend this book, but bear in mind the picture it's providing is of the 1970s, and I don't think much of it still holds today. But still, 4 stars. So, Ian McEwan's latest book, What We Could Know. I can't believe that I keep sort of tabs on Ian McEwan, really, because I've read probably 5 or 6 of his novels, certainly not everything. And thinking about it, it's only really Atonement that I thought was a good book. Now, even Atonement, it's a book in 3 parts. Part 3 is very short. And parts 1 and parts 2, I think, are brilliant pieces of work. But part 3 is absolutely derisory. It's awful. It almost undermines the whole book. Solar is one of the worst books I've ever read. Anyway, but this sounded vaguely interesting. So it's a near future in the UK where there has been ecological disaster with rising sea levels and floods, and about half the Earth's population have disappeared. Either directly they've drowned, or there's not enough food for them. And even the UK has been sort of split into, basically it's become an archipelago as to what bits of the former UK have been flooded and things like that. And I think this is 2100 something, I can't remember the exact year. So basically a century on from our own. But it's a book that spins back between this 2100 future and roughly our own, because there's a poet called Francis Blavey who is sort of still taught, his most famous poem is still taught in schools in 2100. So he's a well-known and well-recognised name. And supposedly, back in the 21st century, to celebrate his wife's a significant birthday of hers, he wrote this poem, invited 6 other guests or 7 other guests to attend with his wife, where he would read it, but he would never publish the poem. It was a unique gift just for her. And indeed, the best bit of the book, I feel, is where while he's reading the poem, and this poem is not read to us, it's not written out in the book for us to read, and I'll tell you why in a minute. The best bit is where these 6, 7 listeners it's really hard to sit and concentrate and listen and take in every single word of a really long poem. So McEwan portrays where their minds are wandering at various points. Then they come back into the poem, then they wander again. And I did think that was really well done and funny. And the reason I say that the poem is not produced in this book is because, as I say, he wrote it on a scroll as a unique artefact, gave it to his wife for the present, and would not allow it to be published anywhere, even though one of the people in attendance at this reading is his agent. So in 2100, there is an academic who wants to track down this poem that no one's ever seen. Because obviously the wife and the other witnesses of that evening, in the 21st century, they're all long dead. But he believes that it's that he can find the scroll. Now, before I get into the minutiae of that, one of the things that bothers me about this book is that in this 21st century near future, although half of the UK and half of the world has gone, the people there still seem to be doing pretty much what they were doing in the 21st century, that they don't seem terribly bothered or threatened by half the world disappearing. There's no sort of sense of anxiety or tension. It's like, yeah, we're the ones who remain, and we'll carry on doing, as normal, which I just found very odd and very unbelievable. So this academic is teaching in a university. There are all the libraries and universities have moved up onto high ground. This one's in the Highlands of Scotland, because obviously they're out of the floods that way. And the 2 greatest inconveniences, it seems to be in the future, this future world, is one, that you have to have a shared toilet. People live in apartments effectively, so they have to share bathrooms. And the other is the food isn't as good because there isn't a diverse range of food. It's absolutely potty to me. His own students, they're not interested in history. They like reading literature, but when he's trying to present them that this, even though they like this poet and they know this poet, they've read his most famous poem, he's trying to interest them in this possibly unique poem, and it's, they're not up for it. And in the end, they walk out of his class because he and his partner are trying to present a sort of historical, how did we get to our present time from the 21st century and all that sort of happened in between, with the flooding and everything. They're not interested. This is the world we live in. Let's make do with it. And as I say, I really struggled with that sort of philosophy, really. But the other thing is, the poem was written about his wife. His wife was married to a man who she deeply loved, but unfortunately he contracted early onset Alzheimer's and was fading away from her. And in her sort of isolation and desperation, she hooked up with this poet and eventually married him and gave up her own sort of intellectual and academic pursuits in order to do, and in a way she just became his secretary. So it's a very much sort of downgrading her own status and really sort of stunting her own life and her own ambitions. Okay, I mean, I can sort of believe, I can accept that, I guess. But the second part of the book is this academic, after quite an interesting treasure hunt, has uncovered her secret journal, because everything up to this point had come from archives in various universities, including Francis Blathy's archive, in which was her journals. It was all sort of mixed up. But she had a secret journal, which he managed to uncover after a treasure hunt. So the second part of this book is the contents of that journal, told, you know, literally in the time in the 21st century as she was writing it and chronicling everything. And gradually we realise, and it takes over the story, we get the very small concerns of these people to do with their love lives and, you know, their desires and stuff, which I just thought clashed and conflicted with the much bigger picture of the, you know, dystopia. And I really wasn't interested in it. And the other thing is, he comes across as a complete pompous, full of himself because he's aware of his reputation and everything. He's not a likeable character. And she initially is seen as the sort of the saving grace in terms of characters. But the second part in her journal, she becomes, or you see that she's just as dislikable as he is, the way she treated her first husband, how she got together with Francis Blavey, which I won't spoil, and the bond and the secret that keeps them together. And it's all just rather tawdry, sort of human stuff, which again goes back to this question of, well, it's just people being people. Even though the half the world has disappeared beneath the waves, people are still, you know, emphasising in the second half of this book the petty emotions and desires in the face of this big picture that doesn't seem to weigh on them at all. I mean, to be fair, in her life the cataclysm hadn't happened, but she was very aware of it. And the poem, this mystery poem that Francis Blavey wrote to her, is very suspicious because it sort of foregrounds their love and their bond and their relationship against nature. It's a nature poem. But everyone knows that Francis Blavey was a denier of climate change. He's not interested in nature other than putting it in his poems for the imagery or whatever. But he himself is completely uninterested in the fate and future of nature. So people, you know, this academic is suspicious, you know, what's going on here? And indeed, one of the conspiracy theories that have kept this myth going about this poem for a century is that one of the witnesses of this poetry reading said that it's so pro-nature, it's so sort of about, you know, the threat to, you know, biodiversity and everything, that she reckons the reason it was never published, that he never published it, is because he was paid off by the oil companies who didn't want that poem by a popular poet to get out into the mainstream, which is a bit of a stretch that poets have that amount of influence. But anyway, we can allow that. We can give that poetic licence. So that gets resolved, and I won't spoil it, you know, into the nature of what this poem is. We never read the poem, but through her journal, we get sort of sufficient clues to build up the picture. So I just thought this book was sort of failed, really. It failed on its dystopic scale because A, no one seemed that, the survivors didn't seem that bothered by it, and B, they carried on with their sort of small petty emotions and dealings as if nothing had happened, as if nothing had changed. So really, really poor. 2 stars. The 5 Sorrowful Mysteries of Andy Africa by Stephen Buoro. So this is a book by an Anglo-Nigerian author, and the action takes place in Nigeria, and the main character is a 15-year-old boy who has a lot going for him in that he and a female student called Fatima are very, very bright. They sort of get special tutoring at school, extra tutoring. They're really well read because of their inspiring teacher. They have a really good set of friends, and they are Christians. Although the female sort of study partner, she's called Fatima, is Muslim. And this book is divided into 5 parts, as per the title, the 5 Sorrowful Mysteries. I don't know exactly what they are in the Christian sort of theology, but they seem to me a sort of another version of the Stations of the Cross. Forgive me if I've got that wrong. So the book is divided into 5 parts. The problem is that the major incident of this book and all the dramatic detail happens in the second section, whereby this guy, Andy Africa, and Africa is a nickname that's given to him by his mates. He hates it as a nickname. So all the good things he has, there are also some bad things. One is that he's never met his father, that his older brother died before he could meet him, but he's visited constantly by the brother's ghost and tormented by him. And indeed, he's writing a cycle of poetry in conversation with his brother, and indeed wins a prize, literary prize, because of the poetry. But he's Christian in a Christian community, but they live amongst Muslims in Nigeria, and the two are there's always tensions between the two communities. And the big problem he has is that he's obsessed with blonde hair and blonde girls, which means white women. And there aren't too many of them where he lives in Nigeria. But he's lucky enough that one turns up, because in their religious community, the priest is a man from England, and he's brought over a white teenager who's a family friend, and Andy falls in love with her from a distance. And the community is throwing a welcoming party for this girl. And basically, because tensions have been rising between the two communities, this party is attacked by Muslims, and there are some deaths, there's burnings of Christian businesses, and Andy's own mother is paralysed and has to be in a wheelchair. And that all happens in the second section, and it's powerful stuff, it's well rendered. But then what we have for the rest of the book, all the tension is drained. So they sort of go on a pilgrimage, or not a pilgrimage, but Andy's still sort of trying to discover the identity of his father. His mother won't tell him. His mother flies into these before she's in a wheelchair, she flies into these rages and goes into sort of cutting off conversations about certain topics, and that's never really explained why. At the time, it just seems she's wholly unreasonable. And by the end of the book, you realise why she's like that, because you're looking through Andy's eyes and all these secrets that she doesn't want to share, including who his father turns out to be. Again, I won't spoil that sort of big sort of reveal. But he goes off in search of his father and eventually finds him. And in the end, part 5, Andy and his 3 mates, because the white girl that he's forged a relationship with, which is a very strange relationship, they seem so desperate not to say the wrong thing. It's very much like teenagers in love. And yeah, they're teenagers, I get it, they're 15-year-olds, but it's not very interesting. They're so careful around each other. They're so guarded in their language. There's also the racial difference. I get why, but it doesn't make for very good reading. It makes for very teenage, young adult reading in the middle of this novel. Anyway, she eventually goes back to England, so he's sort of a bit bereft. And he's thinking, all this time there's been this girl Fatima, who, I've known for years, we're so close, but she's Muslim, so I could never really marry her. Okay, I get it. If you can't marry across the two ethnicities, the two religions, sorry, not ethnicities, the two religions, that's perfectly understandable in the context of Nigeria. But he keeps returning back to the thought that, I should have gone with Fatima, we could be happy, we could have a family. No, you've told us you can't do that. It's not possible. So don't keep harping back on it. Anyway, the book ends with they decide that they're going to get out of Nigeria and they're going to go to Europe. And so they're going to go across a people smuggling network. I won't spoil it. But none of that really holds together in an interesting and engaging way after you've had the sort of big climax in section 2, second chapter. So it didn't really work. There are some good bits of writing, but as a whole it didn't really work. 3 stars. And on to Pharricide by Vincent de Swarte, French author. So I really enjoyed this. I gave this 5 stars. It was one of those books that's a sort of little gem that you have no expectations going in, and it absolutely delivers. So this man applies for the job on a lighthouse and doesn't want anyone there to, you know, sort of familiarise him with it and all that. He's done the job before, but what he's seeking most is isolation. That's what he's after. And of course, a lighthouse is a sort of perfect place for it. He's a taxidermist as a hobby. So, you know, when he finds dead things that have washed up, or, you know, birds that he stuffs them and he mounts them. But gradually you realise that this is, and I don't think this is a giveaway, this is a serial killer's sort of leisure pursuit for his downtime, is stuffing dead animals and, in his mind, giving them life, bringing them back to life. But eventually, within the context of this book, although he's done it before the book started, you find out, he starts turning his death dealing skills to people, and it's just really well written. You're really inside the mind of this guy, which is somewhat unsettling because he's a serial killer. And he meets this woman who's of similar bent, i.e. she's perfectly capable of killing people and is, you know, considered killing her husband and sort of shacking out with him in the lighthouse. It's just really, really good. I really enjoyed it. It reminded me of that book Rogue Trooper from the 1920s. That, again, that sort of heightened individual mind that's sort of constantly, you know, looking around for. In the case of Rogue Trooper, he's being hunted. He's an assassin, but he's being hunted down to the ground, and so he's hyper aware of you know, sounds and other people. As is this guy. You know, has anyone got a telescope trained on him from land to see what he's doing? You know, doing things, moving what turned out to be bodies on this sort of small crop of land that the lighthouse is mounted on. I just loved it. 5 stars. Now, when I read the Most Sacred Memory of Man by the Senegalese author, quite a few people posted the comments that the book that's referred to in there, and I'll post my link to the review because it's a really good book, that this is the original book that sort of launches the ideas for the Most Sacred Memory of Men. So this is by a Malian writer, Yambo Ouologuem. And it's a fun ride. It is a satire, and for me, whenever you have satire in literature, be it Orwell's 1984 or other books, the character work can not stand up because the satire is the highest value for the author rather than the character work. And to some extent that's present here, but it's still a good read. It's an absolute sort of wild ride. So it sort of goes through from about the 11th century up to the 19th century very, very quickly, about how this African empire of Nechem was established, and its sort of Jewish and Islamic roots. But it really, the bulk of the book is from the the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, when it's ruled by this sort of emperor who is, you know, like a Roman emperor, is, you know, assassinating people, playing off people against each other. He's dealing with the colonial French and sort of trying not to get, you know, exploited by them. He's a really sort of wily Machiavellian operator. He has these 2 hitmen who've trained asps, you know, the poisonous snakes, to kill the political targets. It's very funny, very well done. They're entertaining characters. There's some brilliant bits of writing. So, for example, sort of voodoo is used to make zombies workers, and one of them escapes. And as the drugs are still in him, but he's sort of slowly sort of managing to sort of overthrow the control of the drugs, and we get a brilliant description of what life was like for him as a zombie slave. Really well done. There's a really nicely done, quite early on, seduction scene between 2 slaves by a river, and you think, oh, thank God for this. This is a bit of a break from the sort of the pell-mell breakneck speed that we've had up to here, of, as I say, you've gotten from the 11th century to the 19th century very, very quickly, and then once you've established this this Machiavellian character, we get a mental break, or it seems we get a mental break for these two slaves who sort of, feel desire for each other and enact that desire. But oh no, you've been lulled in, because what that leads to immediately is the emperor figure. First of all, he's got them both under his thumb now, because obviously they were seen making love with each other, and he straight away instigates FGM, which is sort of brutally inserted. So that's one of the outcomes. And the man in this slave couple, he now has sort of become one of the emperor's informers and messenger boys for all of his high politics, this humble slave. And indeed, this couple have 5 children, and they're all taken on under the wing of the emperor, and one is selected to replace him when he eventually dies. So the last part of the book is somewhat different in that we follow the chosen kid. Wow. We follow the chosen kid when goes off to university in Paris, and then it's become the African colonial in Paris. It's a different tone, enjoyable in its own way, but it is different. And again, I'm not going to spoil what happens to him, but it's almost like a sort of separate book or mini book. So all in all, this is a wild ride and highly enjoyable. I didn't feel it was as profound as the most sacred memory of men, because, as I say, this is satire, and to me that always takes it one level away from the literariness. That doesn't mean it's badly written or anything, but just many of the things that go up to make a novel, such as deep characterisation and the importance of metaphor and things like that, are not as prized in a satire, but still highly enjoyable. 4 stars. And on to Stella Gaitano's Edo Souls. So this is a work from South Sudan, although the author now lives in Germany, and it's set in the 1970s. So it's when Sudan had gained its independence but had not yet fallen prey to its civil war, and South Sudan gaining its independence, which didn't happen until 2011. And it starts off with life in a dirt poor village, and literally dirt poor, in that there's no communal graveyard. Everyone buries their relatives in the front yard and then pours concrete over them. And it's a really engaging portrait of the village life, of the rituals and joy and celebrations when they've got nothing. They've got absolutely nothing. And the female characters are really sort of in control here. But unfortunately, the main female character that we're introduced to, she has had 9 births, and they've all lived through, she's delivered them all, and they're all alive, but they die very, very young. They're not cot deaths, but it's that sort of type of death. And it fractures her mind, hardly unsurprisingly. And she has another daughter, and she's so convinced that this one's going to die that she sort of doesn't invest anything into her early days, because she just assumes that she's going to die. And her 2 best female friends basically end up bringing up this kid, because the mother sort of fails to do so. And this girl is called Lucy, because one of the things I didn't know this book introduced me to is that while North Sudan is Muslim, South Sudan is Christian, which I didn't know. And eventually Lucy's mum dies of natural causes, and at the funeral, which is a sort of 8-day event with as much sort of joy and celebratory as lamentation, she's proposed to by this young guy who's just finished university, and she agrees to marry him, but he wants to move out of the village and into city life. So that's the sort of first third of the book, and it's really, as I say, the portrait of village life in South Sudan in 1970, I just thought was fabulous. And Lucy and her mother were both great characters. So she moves to the big city with her husband, and it doesn't, the writing isn't as good because I felt there were a lot of cliches of village girl, peasant in the big city and all the differences. But that did improve. We did get sort of more useful and more trenchant sort of contrasts between city and village as we moved on. But one of the things is, so this guy and her and Lucy, they move in with a university friend of his who's quite high up in the military, also Christian, but quite high up in the military. And so they're well off, you know, have a big house, that's why they can stay there. And this soldier's wife basically treats Lucy as a servant girl, gets her to do all her chores and stuff. And when the soldier finds out that his wife has done this to his friend's wife, he goes mad and basically banishes his wife because the bro code is, I guess, is stronger. Anyway, eventually they make up and the wife's allowed to come back into the house. And Lucy doesn't have to do the chores kind of thing. And, you know, up to that point, it's fine, apart from, as I say, some rather sort of obvious writing about sort of city versus village. But then for the second half of the book, the author takes a strange decision, I feel, in that we get different perspectives. Lucy is the best goddamn character in the book, and she becomes virtually silent for the second half of the book because we get the perspective of the soldier's wife, the husband, Lucy's husband, and other characters. Each get their own sort of chapters, effectively. And I felt it was doing this because now it wanted to tell the story of the history of South Sudan. Well, it's still Northern Sudan, because this book finishes long before the 2011 revolution. And it was just really unsatisfactory. And it's a strange decision because it began on so beautifully. We were in the hands, we were being accompanied and hosted by such a wonderful character in Lucy. And then she's almost sort of banished from the book. I mean, she isn't. But her voice becomes far less significant. And we get a lot of stuff about the history and the pressures that the society was under, even in the 70s and 80s. Even though sort of the independence was 30 years away. So the book fell away, which is a bit disappointing because up to then I'd been thoroughly engaged. I gave it 3 stars. And on to False Wall by Cuban writer Carlos Manuel Alvarez. Yeah, this book didn't really do a lot for me, despite its hype and high praise. So the first part of the book is a polyvocal novel about exiles who've come from all sorts of different countries in Central and Southern America and washed up in the United States, but they seem to be in a sort of hinterland where they're almost moving around like ghosts. And there's lots of different styles and different plot lines amongst this polyvocal novel part, in that, you know, there's a planned heist, there's a restaurateur, there's all sorts of voices, and I felt ho-hum, and I didn't think any of them particularly grabbed me. But then we go on to what's actually entitled Interlude, where an exile, a Latin American exile, is part of a group who've been invited over to Berlin, all expenses paid, posh hotel, to pay witness to, or maybe fact-finding and learning about how Germany treats its exiles, its migrants, sorry. And that was fine, you know. We get the 8-day adventure of this guy, the things that he liked doing, the things that he dropped out of and didn't go and see when he took up his own explorations to try and dig underneath the surface. That's fine, you know, it was about 16 pages long, something like that. And then we get into a single voice, so no longer polyvocal, of an exile returning to Cuba. And here was the best bit of the writing. And indeed, the author is a Cuban, so he was writing about what he knew. And we get the desire and dance and sex and sweat of a Cuban party, which I thought was brilliantly brilliantly portrayed, brilliantly written. So we got the story of this guy, as I say, returning back to Cuba. Just give you an example of the writing. There's a moment at every party, and this is it, when people don't know exactly what to do and ideas are slow to come. The pursuit of other bodies is postponed. Glands suddenly stop secreting. Sweat congeals on skin, leaving salt stains of frustration on the neck, armpits and crotch, of cheap or expensive clothes bought in duffel bags by hundreds of dealers from the noisy stalls and labyrinthine marketplaces of sister neighbourhoods in Mexico City, Quito, Puerto España and Georgetown. And so the machinery of desire rusts and the panting animal is taxidermied, without having mingled as it would have liked with the sweat of others in the spasm of the little death, until someone asks, what do we do now? Where do we go? So that's at the end of a party where you've had all the brilliant, as I say, the desire and sex of the dance of Central American dance. I can't remember which one, whether it's a tango or a salsa, whatever it was, but it was brilliantly described. So that was the best section, highly enjoyable. And then we go to the fourth section where we reprise the polyvocal characters and their voices, and some new ones introduced. And all in all, I was left thinking, nothing really. Individual bits, great, good writing in places, but as a whole, I didn't know what I was supposed to make of this at all. 3 stars. And on to Mirceau Cartarescu, the author of Solenoid and Blinding, or Blindness, I can't remember which one it's called. This is his poetry, and this was published in 2020, so not that long ago. But it reads like a teenager's or an adolescent's poetry. It's a lot about girls, observing girls, objectifying girls. Now, poetry has a has a long history of using the female form for imagery and symbolism. That's fine. But in here, it's much more about the leeriness of a teenage boy who's trying to get his rocks off and is literally observing women in the street around him, thinking, oh, I like the look of her. It was a little queasy making, I have to say. It's very hard to tie that into the author of such sublime novels like Solenoid. The vocabulary is there, in these poems, so yeah, that's instantly recognisable from the novels, but there's no sublimity really at all, other than one line, which I'll come to in a minute. As I say, it was slightly queasy making, I have to say, but the one line I did really think sort of gave a glimpse is this. It's in a poem called The Occident. I suppose I meant something, my life meant something. I'd glimpsed God's eye observing me through the microscope as I wriggled on the slide. Now, I thought that was brilliant, a brilliant line. Not enough of that, though, I have to say. It's hard to recommend this. I mean, if you're a Cartarescu completist, you'd have to read it. But in terms of poetry standing, I've read lots of great poets in the last few years, lots of great poetry collections. This would not be one. So it's kind of hard for me to recommend. I gave it 3 stars because the language is impressive, but I was slightly discomforted by its tone. So there we have it. I will say there's some important books coming out in November, which I'm really looking forward to. There's volume 3 of the 7-volume series on the calculation of volume by the Danish author. Forgive me, I can't remember her name. Helen de Wit's novel 25 Years in the Making is coming out in December. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm just going to get my computer to jog my memory. What else is on the list? The Wax Child, which is Olga Ravin's new book, comes out in November. She wrote The Employees, which is a sort of sci-fi novella, which is really good. But then her novel My Work, which I read this year, is probably going to be one of my books of the year. The Helen de Wit book is called Your Name Here, and I think it's quite experimental, quite postmodern, so I'm really looking forward to that. And then in 2026 we get a new book from Claudia Rankine. We get Glyph, the second part of the duology from Ali Smith. There's a new book coming out in translation from Elaine Villar Madruga, who wrote The Tyranny of Flies, which was my book of the year last year. That book's not arriving until September 2026, unfortunately. But, you know, I'm looking forward to quite a few of, you know, my November is perking up. I'm not going to do non-fiction November because I've got 2 or 3 of these new fiction releases that I'm much more interested in, I have to say. So there you have it. Till next time, thank you very much.